The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
With Jerry Hill retiring from the state Senate at the end of next year, 5 candidates are already working hard to win his seat and succeed him in Sacramento.
We begin a series of one-on-one interviews with each of the candidates. Shelly Masur is here. The game is politics. The game is on.
The 13th Senate District runs from Daly City to Sunnyvale, from the San Francisco Bay to the Pacific Ocean. For the past 7 years, the district has been represented by Jerry Hill, but term limits will send him on his way in 2020. With the 2020 primary election in March, 5 candidates already are campaigning hard to win the seat. Today, we begin a series of interviews over the next several weeks with each of the candidates as we get to know better the people who want to represent nearly 1 million residents in San Mateo and northern Santa Clara counties.
Our first interview is with Shelly Masur, who was elected to the Redwood City Council in 2015. Prior to her election, she served on the Redwood City School Board for 10 years, including 2 terms as board chair. She is CEO of the Californians Dedicated to Education Foundation, a statewide nonprofit working on education policies and programs, and she has 20 years of experience working for nonprofits. Welcome. Thank you for being the first of several.
Well, thanks for having me. Always love stopping by and talking to you guys.
Well, let's start with the issue that's I think in your wheelhouse, which is education and the state of our California education system. There's a lot of people who are very, very worried that it is not all it should be, not all it could be. You share that concern, and what do you think is the reason why?
Well, I think it's obviously a very complex issue, right? I think one of the things that has happened over the last 8 years is we've enacted a series of policies that are moving our public education system in the right direction. You know, Kevin, because you've passed some of these laws, we've changed how we fund our schools, so it's a more equitable funding system. We've changed our standards, what we expect kids to know. We've changed how we assess what kids know. We had changed how we look at how schools are serving kids. All of these different pieces put together, I think, are moving us in the right direction. But still, California lags behind most of the country in how it funds its public schools. And I think that's the biggest concern you're going to hear. If you talk to teachers, you talk to parents, you talk to administrators, all of them are going to mention the level of funding that we have. Despite the governor's and the legislature's investment in public education this year, which is the biggest that we've ever been, but our economy has grown and inflation has required that, especially here in the Bay Area. You know, teacher salaries aren't keeping up with the cost of living. We've got some significant challenges around that. And there's definitely a lot of work to do to make all of these changes work for our kids. So it's a lot of change at one time.
So is it how or how much we fund the schools? Or are the two?
Well, I actually think the way we are funding schools now, which is an equity-based formula, we recognize that some kids come to school needing more support than other kids. I think that's the right way to go. But the total amount of money that's in the pot is just not enough to adequately fund our education system.
So, Shelly, not only have you been a school board member, you have a professional background in education. You're working right now in education in addition to being a local office holder. So what I've heard from educators is there has been so much change, and you talked about some of those new policies, a local control funding formula, different ways of addressing education. What I've heard from some educators is, okay, we need a little bit of a timeout to actually allow some of these changes and reforms to take hold. And I see you shaking your head agreeing with that. Let me ask you about the state teachers' retirement system pension obligations, because these are unfunded liabilities that eat away at school district budgets. Not that they shouldn't be properly funded, but if you look at the overall balance sheets of districts, that unfunded liability is a drain on programs. Just talk about some of those dynamics in managing school budgets from the district level.
Yeah, it's true, and of course cities are facing the same issues, right? So, well, as you know, during the recession, the state changed how it was funding pensions, and so that it moved a lot of the obligations down to the local level. So school districts, cities, employees have a greater are paying a greater share to fund our pension system. So that has resulted in, as you just said, significant pressures on school budgets. And I think the last figure I heard from the Redwood City School District is they were spending $1,100 per kid just on pension obligations. And to your point, I agree. Of course, pensions are one of the things that we owe our employees who dedicate their lives to serving their communities, serving kids in their communities. That's an important obligation to fill. I do think that we need to, and the governor did put money in the budget this year to help address some of the obligations, the one time. But I do think the state needs to look at a little bit how it's going to ongoing help school districts address this pension liability. I mean, some of the teachers are paying, I want to say like 18% of their salaries towards their pension obligations. We just talked about a second ago. It's already hard to make it here as a teacher in the Bay Area, and then you put that on top of it, and it's making it kind of impossible. Okay,
so you're running for the state legislature. What are you going to do about it if you get elected? How are you going to improve teacher pay? How are you going to? What bills would you like to introduce or support to solve these problems? Specifically?
Yeah, well, as I said, I do think the state needs to step back in and look at how it is contributing to the state teachers' retirement system, the public employees' retirement system, STRS and PERS, as it used to do. And so one-time infusions of cash are great, but they're not going to address the ongoing challenges that we have with our pension liabilities. So that is one piece that I think needs to be looked at. There's a proposition that's qualified for the ballot for next year, the Schools and Communities First initiative, which would change how we assess commercial property taxes. That would bring more money into the system. You know, as you know, education is anywhere, depending on how you're looking at it, between 45 and 50% of the state budget. So I always talk about we're not going to get a bigger slice of the pie because the state has a lot of things that it needs to do with that money, but we need to make the pie bigger. And it has been growing. So I think one way to do it is through this ballot initiative. I would love to see the legislature take something like that up if the ballot initiative doesn't pass.
Okay. There are a lot of people who think that the school system is too dominated by the teachers' unions, and that we all know it's much easier to pass a ballot measure to build a school than it is to pass a ballot measure to pay the people who are going to work in it. There seems like this weird dichotomy because people think the teachers' union is too strong, and yet there's widespread agreement that teachers are underpaid.
Right.
And you're talking about 40 to 45% of the budget. It just doesn't make sense to me that this isn't a problem that's already been solved. So how do you fix it? Because if you're not going to get more money in the budget, then how do you solve this problem?
Well, as I said, I think you need to make the pie bigger, right? So that when you're putting more money into the budget, you're making that pie bigger. So your slice of the pie naturally gets bigger. That's one piece. You know, one of the things you mentioned is it's easier to pass, you were talking about school bonds. It's easier to pass school bonds than it is to pass ongoing money. And so we do that through local parcel taxes. Jerry Hill actually has a bill this year that would lower the threshold for passing a parcel tax from 2/3 to 55%. If that doesn't pass, I would certainly want to reintroduce it. It's been reintroduced many times. Senator Simitian, when he was in the Senate, introduced it every year. Didn't pass. I'm hoping this year it's going to pass, but it is one way that we can invest in our schools locally.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Stick around. We'll be right back with Shelly Masur.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen. and we're doing the first of a series of interviews with candidates running for the 13th State Senate District. First penguin off the ice floe is Shelly Masur, Redwood City Councilwoman.
I've never heard that one before.
Also, I'm just having this image in my head, like March of the Penguins.
I got a million of them. You know, what can I tell you? Let's talk a little bit about charter schools. Redwood City, as you know better than I do, actually has had to close some schools. One of the things they're citing is the growth in enrollment at charter schools, which are diverting kids from the traditional public school. What is your view on charter schools? Are you pro or anti-charter school?
Well, I really hate that characterization.
Well,
Sorry.
then characterize it another way.
What I will say is this, you know, charter schools had an original intent where they were going to be these sort of models of innovation that school districts could learn from. They'd be freed up from some of the constraints of education code. And in some cases that has happened. There are some places where that's happened. But I think what has happened is we see these large charter management organizations that have essentially become sort of private school districts, and until this year haven't had to comply with a lot of transparency laws that that school districts have to comply with. If you're spending public dollars, I think you need to be able to do your business in public, and they are spending public dollars. And so some of the requirements around having noticed meetings and open meetings in your jurisdiction or accessible to your jurisdiction, those are some things that I think needed to change and have changed in the last year. The other thing that you mentioned is for Redwood City School District, you're right, the district did have to close 4 schools. They lost a significant number of students, both due to the high cost of living and to kids leaving for charter schools. But I think one of the bills that's in the legislature now would allow school districts to consider financial impact as they're making a decision about whether or not to approve a charter school. When we approved the charter schools in Redwood City School District, we didn't have that as part of the consideration, and I think it's an important step in being able to figure out, you know, what's going to be the impact on all of the kids in the district.
So you think there should be charter schools? You think they should just be more tightly controlled and supervised, essentially?
I mean, you know, it's a reality. They're here, and so yeah, I think if we're going to have them, we need to make sure that as they spend public dollars, that they're complying with a lot of the same rules and regulations that our regular public school districts are complying with.
So one last question on education. Yeah. Part of this, getting ready to run for office, getting ready to serve in the Senate, is how you see yourself in that body and how you see yourself as being effective. I assume, given your background, you would like to chair the education committee, something like focus that as a focal point for your service. So let me go ahead and transition then to the state budget. Biggest thing we do in Sacramento every year is pass that state budget. As of the taping of this program, the legislature has passed the main budget bill and a number of trailer bills. The governor's yet to sign the budget. We are awaiting action on that. But what is your overall view of how Sacramento has managed its finances? You know, we've been building this rainy day fund while the economy has been strong, but we do have lots of pension obligations hanging out there. What is your assessment of how the legislature and the governor have been managing the state's finances, and would you change anything about it?
You know, I think in the last several years, the legislature and the governor have been very restrained in spending ongoing dollars, creating new programs despite continued economic growth. I appreciate that there's been a rainy day fund established and that you continue to put money in. I think we said it's about $15 billion at this point in the rainy day fund, plus some other reserves, which is going to be important when we come to an economic downturn. We always say locally, and I think this is the same thing that we need to think about at the state level. You spend one-time dollars on one-time expenses, and you spend ongoing dollars on ongoing expenses, right? So some of the actions that you and the governor have taken this year to, as we were just talking about, address pension obligations, a one-time infusion of cash into the pension systems that helps address the obligations but doesn't obligate the state in an ongoing way, is the right way to approach it. At the same time, we do have ongoing needs in the state that we need to address. So it's always a balancing act of what are the things that we can pay for in an ongoing way that we could pull back if we needed to in a recession. What are the things that we see that we can address individually? So sticking with education, last year the state put $125 million into teacher residency programs because we know we're facing a teacher shortage. Teacher residency programs are a way to both bring in a more diverse workforce as well as make it possible for people to move into teaching more quickly and get them well trained as they're entering into classrooms. That's a one-time expense that's addressing an ongoing problem and helps change the system so that it's better serving the people it's intended to serve.
So you want to go in being an education expert. Everybody carves out their area of expertise. That's just the nature of the environment there. Is there one bill, one piece of legislation that you think, when I get up there, I can't wait to introduce this reform, this change, whatever it might be?
For the record, I used to hate this question when I was a first-time candidate.
Just for the record, it's a great question.
Thank you.
You do have to have a reason for going up there other than you think it's a good idea.
Do you?
Absolutely.
No, I'm just kidding.
At least when you're on our show.
I'm kidding.
At least when you're on my show.
Of course.
And I'll ask him again later. If he doesn't like the question, I'll ask it again.
No, I mean, it is a good question. But I will say this, and I think probably part of the reason you felt this way is you don't know necessarily what's going to happen in the ensuing year, right? I don't know what bills are going to be introduced in the next legislative session. So I don't know what is going to need to be changed or addressed by the time I get there in January of 2020 when the bills start getting introduced. That being said, as I said a few minutes ago, if this bill doesn't pass to lower the threshold for parcel taxes, I would love to reintroduce that bill. As Kevin just talked about a few minutes ago, all the changes in education policy are significant. You really couldn't change much more in the system, and I totally agree. In fact, have put together a coalition at the state level through my job that includes education advocates, all the education associations, and put together a set of 8 policy recommendations, many of which are sort of like stay the course, don't make any significant changes, address things in a smaller way because we need to let things settle in. We need to, for example, we need to change how schools are reporting how they spend their money, but not how we're bringing it down to the school districts. Just make it easier for the public to understand how schools are spending the money that they're getting, and that's being worked on. So there's some tweaks that we need to make. We need to see with this new dashboard of how it's addressing how schools are serving kids. We need to look at that. But I also have a background in public health. So I have a master's in public health, and so health is another area I care a lot about. I really appreciate the work that the legislature and the governor has done to expand healthcare access this year, and bringing back the individual mandate here in California, which is a critical piece of the pie when you're trying to make it possible for everybody to have access to high-quality health care. So I'd love to see where we sit when I get up there and then work on that as well.
Okay. We're going to take another break. Stick around. We'll be right back with Shelly Masur, candidate for the state Senate.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen, and over here we have Shelly Masur, a candidate for the 13th State Senate District. Thank you again for being here.
My pleasure.
Let's ask the classic, since I've already asked the one you don't like, let's ask classic campaign
He's never going to
question.
forget that.
Tell me,
right?
Tell us why you're running. What do you want to do when you get up there?
Well, we've talked about a few of the things that I want to do. I do want to work on education, and I do think, given the impact on the state budget, as well as, our public education system is really the cornerstone of democracy. It's an equity vehicle. It is the way that our economy is going to stay strong. Here we are, the 5th largest economy in the world, and Silicon Valley, where we are, is really one of the biggest economic engines of California's economy, and we have to have a strong public education system to continue to make sure that we can have people prepared to work in that. So I do think education is a really critical piece of the puzzle and what I bring to the table. And I think it's important to have people who understand education policy sitting in the seat up in the state legislature. I mentioned just a second ago health and my background in public health. Healthcare also foundational to how we are able to be in this world. Education and health are inextricably linked, and so how we make sure that people have access to high quality health care, I think is going to be a critical piece, and another reason why I want to go to Sacramento. Of course, locally, we're all working on housing and transportation, how those two are linked together. For me, how they're also linked to health and education, because they are all linked in my mind. The work that we've been able to do in Redwood City to address our housing crisis, both through market rate and affordable housing, through some of the committees that I sit on, thinking about regional transportation. The state has a role to play in that as well. So bringing that experience from the local level. And then finally, we all have to be focused on climate change. You guys probably know this, but maybe some of the viewers don't know. San Mateo County is the most at-risk county for sea level rise, given our situation between the bay and the ocean. And California certainly has been a leader, and I think you have a bill this year enacting some of the governor's orders, Governor Brown's orders, to go carbon neutral by 2045. So we need to keep leading on that, especially as the Trump administration continues to roll back environmental protections. California needs to continue to be a leader, needs to be continuing to advocate for that.
So let me just circle back on the housing piece, since you mentioned that. Senate Bill 50, Senator Wiener's legislation to allow more density around transit centers, but also taking some power away from local governments in terms of local land use authority and sort of drawing on the regional concerns with closing the jobs housing imbalance. What was your view of that piece of legislation? How do we get this balance right where we are really incentivizing, encouraging, in some cases compelling local governments to zone for housing? What's your overall view of that approach, and what might you do to address this crisis?
So I'll take the first part of your question first. On SB 50, I thought that the thing that was good about it is it really forced local governments to pay attention to the housing crisis, and that is important for those that weren't. As I said, in Redwood City, we've been building a lot of housing, so we are paying attention to it. We're well ahead of our required numbers in terms of our market rate housing, and now we're working on getting there in our affordable housing. So I do think that focus has been really critically important, and I appreciate that Senator Wiener has been out in front on that. The way the bill was structured specifically was more of a punishment approach, and it's rather than an incentive approach. And so one of the things that I have been talking about and have talked to legislative staff about is that I would love to have seen that bill written so that local governments had an opportunity to develop their own plans where they were developing housing around transit, and that you would have to do it by a specific date. I don't know what the exact date would have been, but choose a date in the near future so that you're not pushing it out 10 or 15 years. But give local governments a year, 2 years to develop their own transit-oriented development plans. San Bruno's done it. They just spent a couple years developing a plan. They passed it by the voters, and now they're ready to implement it. So it looks like they haven't done anything, but they've been preparing, and now, like Redwood City did with its downtown precise plan, they've cleared the way for people to come in and build relatively rapidly around transit. So my thought was put that in the bill, and then if you don't do that plan by whatever the specific date was, then you're going to just be subject to the state rules around where you have to build high-density housing. On the flip side, though, I do think it's important to build housing near transit, but we also have to be building the jobs near transit, because if you live near transit but then your job is nowhere near any kind of transit, you're still going to get in your car and drive. So we have to be thinking about that as well as we're putting the pieces together. And then the last thing I'll say is I do think the state needs to look at cities as partners in this effort. We don't want cities to be the enemies. I recognize that there are some cities that have specifically zoned to avoid having any new housing built, and we do need to address that. But cities have got to be the partners in this effort. And as you know very well, as a former council member, cities don't build the housing for the most part. Cities set the stage. They zone appropriately. They work with developers to make it possible. But ultimately, we have to make it possible for the developers to come in and do it. And particularly as we're looking at affordable housing, I really think the state, which has taken some good steps this year, needs to be thinking about how are we going to fund affordable housing, particularly moderate housing, so housing that meets the needs of our teachers or other people making sort of a moderate income who currently can't afford to live here. It's the hardest kind of housing to build, as you know, because there's no federal money that comes down for it like there is for very low income housing. And the state has put some money in this year for building this, what we call moderate income housing. There needs to be a little bit more attention paid to that, I think. And that's where, back to the state budget question, that's where some of these one-time dollars can really make a big difference in addressing a really significant crisis that we're facing, particularly in the Bay Area.
We've got less than a minute left. Let me ask you just simply, what separates you? There are a lot of people running. For all we know, more may run. What separates you? What distincts? What makes you different from the other candidates?
My breadth of experience, serving as a local school board member for 10 years and now as a city council member, I bring a unique set of perspectives to the table, as well as work that I've done in all of those positions, regionally and at the state level. Served on education advisory committees. I've testified at the state level around education funding. I've been very active with my association so that I'm working regionally and at the state level to represent the interests of our local communities.
Shelly Masur, candidate for the 13th Senate District, thank you for being with us. And thank you for being with us. I'm Mark Simon.
And I'm Kevin Mullen.
And join us next time on The Game.